How about this for a gas station? Good morning, people. In front of us is Fort Amsterdam. We are on the island of Ambon in central Maluku. The VOC captured this fort from the Portuguese. The purpose of the VOC here, not only in Maluku, in all the islands, was to have a monopoly. It was always about the monopoly. What's funny is that in order for the Dutch to take over this fort, this warehouse from the Portuguese, they allied with the local Sultan of Hitu. And when the Sultan discovered that their only interest is the monopoly, to establish the monopoly, he kind of became hostile. And this hostility ended up in a close to 20-year war, like 20-year war, man, between the VOC and the local Hitu kingdom. Now, in that regard, they treated everybody equally. Everybody was the enemy. The locals were the enemy, the Portuguese were the enemy, the Brits were the enemy. Everybody was the enemy. The VOC transformed the place in a military fortress, and there are levels to it. I believe the first level is more for military supplies. The second level would be the barracks where the soldiers would be sleeping. And the third would be to have an overview of the seas. The VOC got bankrupt in 1799. And the main reason for that was extreme corruption. All the territories that were under VOC control are passed to the Dutch government, and essentially the colony continues to be, but not anymore under the control of the corporation. However, there is the small detail of Napoleon. You see, in 1806 the Napoleonic Wars started, and France invaded and annexed the Netherlands, which meant that these here territories also went under the French control. This didn't quite stand very good with the Brits. There has been this charismatic governor of the British East India Company, Sir Stafford Raffles. We will talk about him a little bit in one of the next episodes, who invaded Java in 1811 with the sole purpose to keep the commerce routes open. And by commerce routes, I mean the Malacca Strait. But I repeat, we will talk about Sir Raffles in a future episode. 5 years later, and the Brits hand these territories back to the Netherlands because of the post-Napoleonic War treaties. So everything that was previously owned by the Netherlands went back to the Netherlands. Now the thing is that this didn't quite stand well with the locals. The locals were beginning to be a little bit pissed off with all the different colonizing groups that were essentially playing with their land and their lives. And both the Javanese and the Sumatrans start reacting against the Dutch. And this resulted in a couple of massive wars that lasted for decades. 200,000 plus of local, what we now call Indonesians, died in those wars. However, the Dutch did win them, so they kept the integrity of the colony. Now the Dutch, in order to recover from all the war debts, they passed a law that brought the local populations to their knees. In Dutch, it is called Kultuurstelsel. And this is, let's call it in English, cultivation law. This Kultuurstelsel meant that a big part, I think it was a fourth or a third of the land owned by local peasants would be used to cultivate products that were meant to be exported. Be that sugar, coffee, indigo, you name it. That made a fortune for the Dutch. That made the Netherlands extremely rich. On the other hand, it caused famine to the local populations, a famine that was extremely painful and not easy at all to forget. Local Indonesian nationalism has its roots in the beginning of the 20th century, when suddenly various organizations started to emerge. For example, Sukarno and Hatta were the product of such processes. Another critical event that happened was the Second World War. And it was during the Second World War that the Japanese invaded and conquered these lands in a matter of weeks. I mean, the Second World War proved to the locals that the Dutch not only were they not invincible, they were actually quite easy to beat. Now, in the 3 years of Japanese presence here, the Japanese kind of reinforced the feeling of nationalism of the Indonesians, and they sort of prepared the ground for the future independence of Indonesia. The moment Japan surrendered after the end of the Second World War, I think it was 2 days later that Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed the independence of Indonesia. Now, the Dutch reacted pretty badly to this. They attacked, they tried to invade again these territories. However, this time the locals reacted pretty well. They fought back, guerrilla warfare, and not only that, but they were extremely active in the diplomatic level. In 1949, did the Netherlands hand over these here territories to Indonesia as an independent nation. Now, under heavy US pressure and threat of losing the aid of the Marshall Plan, the Netherlands formally signed a treaty recognizing Indonesian sovereignty. The only area the Dutch kept control of was Western New Guinea in Papua. The specific period that this video is about started immediately thereafter. So let's have a talk. I figured, what better way to talk about the grand finale of the Dutch presence here in Indonesia than this here place. You see, Ambon is the capital of the province of Maluku. And there is no bigger injustice than the way the Dutch treated the Moluccans right after the Second World War. In the 150 plus years after the collapse of the VOC, the Dutch had established an army here, and they called this army the Royal Dutch East Indies Army, the KNIL. Now, in order for us to start discussing this particular matter, we will jump in the car and go back to Ambon. See you there. Bye-bye for now. The guy who took me to Fort Amsterdam asked if I'm okay with him stopping to put gas, you know. I couldn't even imagine that he meant this. Let me show you this incredible characteristic of Ambon. Because Ambon is considered to be the city of music. It is the only Indonesian city, I mean, couldn't be more clear, right? It's the only Indonesian city to have this honor by UNESCO. The local ukulele, sort of, evolved from instruments brought by the Dutch and the Portuguese. And in due time, they mixed with the musical universe of the locals. The most important thing, if you ask me, is the fact that they used music to kind of bring together Christians and Muslims who fought quite heavily back in the 90s. So if music worked for that, then we are all for it, right? This is the gong dedicated to world peace. And boy, do we need it. The original reason for this gong was this pretty brutal religious conflict that happened in this here city in Ambon However, in regards to our story, Ambon here was the prime feeder of soldiers for the KNIL. What on earth are these, man? Oh wow, look at that. Imagine that falling on our heads. Let's not. So when I stopped for breakfast, this is probably the best place, not only for breakfast, but to eat in Ambon, you know? It's flipping amazing. It has a very Dutch name. Now, right after I have my omelette, we will go next door, which is, very close to here, where the new Fort Victoria is. The Fort Victoria, the old one, used to be the center of operations for the VOC. And later, after the bankruptcy of the VOC, it used to be a garrison for the KNIL, the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. And it was at the same fort that one of the most brutal side stories happened. The year is 1623, and VOC officials arrest, torture, and eventually kill 10 English merchants, 9 Japanese samurai, the mercenaries who were in the cutting heads business at the Banda Islands, and 1 Portuguese trader, all of them accused for treason. And like we discussed in Jakarta at Glodok, it was yet another example of paranoia by the local Dutch governor. A guy called Van Spoelt became paranoid that 10 Brits, 9 samurai and a Portuguese were comploting into taking over the spice trade. Look at Jesus having talks with the flock. So back to the Ambonia massacre. I don't know if you lot can grasp the barbarism in this. They arrested 20 people, tortured them to death until they were so exhausted that they ended up admitting to a crime that never happened, and then executed them. And all of this would be happening here at the new Fort Victoria, the fort that a couple of centuries later would become the main garrison of the KNIL. New Fort Victoria is not visitable as it is still a military base. Do you remember the Indonesian dictator Suharto? He received his military training at the KNIL. This guy was Pattimura. He was one of the main revolutionaries against the Dutch. As you can see here, his future was not the brightest. So you can actually see all around this statue more or less the description of Pattimura's revolt. How they gathered, how he was elected leader. For example, the scene of the execution happened here. He was executed right in front of the Fort Victoria. The local rebels, the local people who wanted a free, not necessarily Indonesia, but who wanted to decolonize, they were sort of against the KNIL. That is Christina Martha Tiahahu. Now, Christina Martha, let's stick to that, was a teenager when she rebelled against the Dutch. Her monument sits on top of this hill overlooking the Bay of Ambon over there. She and her father were captured by the Dutch in 1817. Her father was executed in front of her eyes at age 17, mind you. As for her, she was spared because of her age. She was put on a ship to move her to Java in order for her to be on exile at a coffee plantation or something. She went into hunger strike on the ship and consequently died. Her body was thrown in the sea. So this is my point, right? The KNIL represented the long arm of the colonial rule. It's quite amazing what happened to KNIL after the Second World War. They fought together with the Dutch until 1949, when the Dutch were essentially forced by the United States to let Indonesia be free and a sovereign country. For the United States, Indonesia and Sukarno and Hatta were anything but, communist danger. For the United States, Indonesia was anti-communist. That was about to change when they chose a third path, but we will talk about this in a future episode. Look at this, a Hindu soldier. He died in 1945. You realize that this Hindu soldier died fighting against the Japanese, fighting for the Brits. This cemetery, the war cemetery of Ambon, is also located on the ground of a former KNIL garrison. Look at the beauty of this. There are a lot of ants here, man. Better not touch. It says B.B. van Muurik, soldier KNIL. Groeneveld, also KNIL. So, where I'm going with all this is the following. The moment the Japanese lost the war and retreated, that was the moment the Dutch came back. They fought for 4 years with the Indonesians, future Indonesians, and they were forced by the United States to give up the island. And this is the problem, because immediately thereafter, the soldiers of KNIL were in danger. The new Indonesian army was much too powerful, and they were thought to be the next targets of the Indonesian army. Now, what happened next is heartbreaking, actually. No matter what you think about KNIL, traitors to the Indonesian cause or whatever, no matter what you think about them, what happened to them next is heartbreaking. And for this, we are going back to the Netherlands. See you in a bit. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? We are in the Dutch city of 's-Hertogenbosch, and we are here to take a short bus ride to a place of very sad memory for a big part of the Moluccan soldiers of the KNIL that ended up here in the Netherlands. So the story goes like this. It's 1951. The Dutch government here in Europe promised the Moluccan soldiers that they would protect them. And by protecting, they meant they would bring them here to the Netherlands, where they would continue their service, and when the time is ripe, they would attack Indonesia back and reclaim their island. The purpose of doing so was to establish an independent Moluccan country. So with all these promises being made, they actually managed to move some more than 12,000 Moluccans from there to here, to the Netherlands. However, upon arrival, the soldiers, the military personnel, were stripped of their ranks, which meant that they could not work for the army anymore. And they essentially became a problem. Asylum seeker problem here in the Netherlands. And one of the solutions that the Dutch government found was to temporarily place them here in areas such as this. This was, I think it was the first Nazi concentration camp outside of Germany in Europe. The other ones came later. It wasn't a transit camp, but it also was not an extermination camp. So you get the idea. And this idea is a sinister one. At least I find it sinister. How on earth can you bring such a population here in a former Nazi camp? About 300 Moluccan soldiers and their families stayed here in this barrack. I truly wonder what the people responsible for bringing the Moluccans here were thinking. And it's quite interesting because it was a concentration camp, then it turned to a prison by the Allies, where they would gather literally everyone who they suspected was a collaborator, and then it became a home for those Moluccans. The original idea by the Dutch government was to place them wherever there was an empty building, no matter what that empty building used to be. I mean, how was it? Okay, we promised them this and that. Now they're here, we don't know where to put them, so we put them to former Nazi camps. I understand that this neighborhood developed from the first people that were placed in the camp. I mean, Moluccan people. What you do see, however, are the colors of the flag, of the Moluccan flag. This flag, by the way, is totally illegal in Indonesia. And let me show you this monument. It was erected this year, actually. This guy, Sumokil, was the president of the South Moluccan Islands. And he was executed by the Indonesian government some 60 years ago. Despite the efforts of his widow and probably quite a lot of organizations, the Indonesian government never made public the resting place. The relationship between the Moluccans and the Dutch government is, or was, I don't think it still is, a very troubled one. I mean, the promise for an independent Moluccan state would cast a very big shadow, you realize, in their everyday life here in the Netherlands. And as years passed by, they finally gave up on it. All that being said, there have been years of lead in the relationship between the Dutch state and the Moluccan community. And we will be talking about all of that. But before we do that, we need to go to the next destination. So let's go wait for the bus. And we are back. This is Den Haag. This is the capital city of the Netherlands. The relationship between the Moluccans and the Dutch has not been an easy one. The self-proclaimed government of the South Moluccan Republic was living here. It was a clandestine government, you know. So you realize what kind of explosive mixture all that was. So here's the story of the flag. The blue represents the sea, the white is for peace and harmony, green is for the land, which is fertile, and red is the blood, I guess. So look at this, you can see the map of the Netherlands, right, with all the locations where the Moluccans ended up. And there is one location that is completely empty. The reason is that the Dutch constructed that island after the Moluccans came to the Netherlands. So if the first generation of Moluccans here in the Netherlands suffered, the second generation was full of trauma and anger. They were the generation that proceeded to make a mess with the Dutch society. After the execution of the South Moluccan president Sumokil, whose memorial we saw earlier, an angry mob of young Moluccans here in the Netherlands proceeded to set fire to the embassy of Indonesia right here in Den Haag. Back in 1970, the president of Indonesia, Suharto, we will talk a lot about him in future videos, had planned a visit to the Netherlands This did not stand well with the Moluccan community, who ended up taking the ambassador of Indonesia hostage here, in his own house, in a nearby place called Wassenaar. This act resulted to the death of a police officer, and it only got resolved when President Suharto decided to postpone his visit. Years later, Moluccans plotted to kidnap the Queen of the Netherlands, Queen Juliana. This was a failed operation because the police were onto it. And if all this wasn't enough, in December 1975, a group of radical Moluccans hijacked a train in Weister. They executed the driver and a couple of passengers. This siege lasted for 12 days. Almost at the same time, the General Consulate of Indonesia in Amsterdam was seized. A standoff that lasted for 2 weeks. None of these events, however, could match the brutality of what happened in 1977. It was on the same day that a group of radical Moluccans took hostage another train in an area called the Punt in the north of the country. And on the same day, another group took 105 children and 5 teachers hostage in a primary school. This whole situation lasted for 20 days, and the way it ended is remarkable here, because the Dutch government launched a proper military assault. I mean, even fighting jets and elite Marine Corps were involved. Anyway, the situation with the school seizure ended up without any victims. However, the train, that was a different story, man. You see, the train hijacking ended up with 6 hijackers dead and 2 passengers. Now, this kind of macabre list of events finally ended a year later in 1978. Moluccan radicals invaded a government house in Assen, executing 3 employees. This event also got resolved with the intervention of the Marine Corps. The events of 1977 and 1978 showed the Dutch society and the Moluccan community just how bad things were. And the terrorism approach from the Moluccans finally ended. And there were some steps that the Dutch government overtook to try and soothe the troubled souls of the Dutch Moluccan communities. What do you lot make of that story, man? If this isn't the absolutely quintessential ending to the whole Dutch East Indies colonial whatever, I don't know what is, right? Yeah. So that's all from me. That's all from Ambon. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.